there anything I need besides the question sheet?
No, that's
We're
it.
good? Okay.
Can I
That
take
is
notes on
it.
the back of the question sheet?
You can.
Do
Okay.
you want some paper?
No,
You're good? Okay.
Whenever you're ready.
Being the recipient of the Soccer World Cup or the International Olympics is generally seen as something that a country should take pride in. And furthermore, the impacts of it are generally massive economic gains for the country as a whole. The tourism and the internal commercial business involved with getting ready for the Olympics stimulates the economy as a whole. However, when Brazil was awarded both the 2014 World Cup in soccer and the 2016 Olympics, not everyone experienced that financial joy. See, most of Brazil does live under this great economic growth that they've seen in the last year. However, some of the country does not. Mr. Welty, this eye contact thing isn't going to work if you don't look at me. Thank you.
Sorry.
Much of the population lives in the favelas, the low-income neighborhoods in urban areas of Rio de Janeiro and Sao Paulo. And a Guardian article written by Owen Wilson found that over 19,000 people were relocated in order to build stadiums for these two major international events, with zero economic recompensation for their movement, a cost that they'll likely be paying for the rest of their lives. And this is just one example internationally about how, as a country moves up economically, not everybody is included in the growth. I've talked about these many times in high schools through speech and debate and international extemporaneous speaking. It's something that interests me greatly and something I plan on studying in college. But there was no reason for me to not start researching it now, which is why I was so interested in economics, and it's why I'm here presenting to you today's topic. Poverty in a growing world, more specifically an Eastern Asian study of economic growth. I'm Blaise Schaefer, and let's begin. Economic growth is generally seen as a good thing. And as gross domestic product increases in countries around the globe, Theo Hitchris from the University of York in Great Britain finds that not only is there better health care, and that can be seen through increased life expectancy and lower infant mortality rates, but also the overall quality of life increases. The ability to reach consumer goods and the ability to spend more time on recreational activity generally increases the Human Development Index of a country. However, this isn't always the only implication. Furthermore, the Danish Institute of Human Rights found that as the gross domestic product increases in the country, it tends to see democratization, meaning that as people have more time, more recreation time, that sometimes gets used to promote human rights and fight for increased liberties, leading to a breakdown of authoritarian practices. South America is a clear example of this. Whereas many countries in South America had either communist or authoritarian regimes in the mid-1990s, high rates of economic development spurred by foreign direct investment from Europe and the United States helped produce more democratic states in South America. However, these benefits aren't always widespread. See, sometimes economic growth leaves some behind. An in-depth study by the Brookings Institute, specifically by Professor Gary Burtless, found that when economies grow rapidly, especially in quick industrialization periods, 20 to 30% of the population is often left behind, meaning their incomes stay relatively the same and the poverty rates for them never change. And this can be seen for many reasons, whether or not it's because the government doesn't feel a need to improve the quality of life for everyone, or potentially that it's unfeasible. But the fact of the matter is that they're left behind. An example of that is that Brazilian urban planning for the international events. Now, South America had their major economic revolution, and Europe and the United States experienced theirs decades ago. But right now, a massive economic revolution is happening in Eastern Asia. And this can be seen in World Bank statistics. In Southeast Asia, 8 out of 10 countries are experiencing a yearly average of 5% GDP growth, a number that more developed nations can't even imagine seeing on a year-to-year basis, let alone averaging it. However, not all of these countries are stable. See, violence is still incredibly prevalent in Eastern Asia. The Philippines and Myanmar have massive, widespread, state-sponsored violence against minority populations. And Rohingyan ethnic minorities are being cleansed in Myanmar. Both of these populations, targeted drug cartels in the Philippines, and the Rohingya in Myanmar are low-income, impoverished groups that were left behind when their countries economically developed. Like Gary Burtless said, there are always communities that get left behind. And this is why an economic study of Southeast Asia is so critical, because those getting left behind are being targeted by violence, which is why it's so important to ask today's question. Does GDP growth have a causal relationship with poverty rates in Eastern Asia? Causal not to be mistaken with casualty, meaning something's being caused by another thing. The hypothesis that I put forth today is that there is a strong causal relationship between GDP growth and poverty rates. So today we're going to engage in a correlational study and move forward with a Granger causality test to not only see if there's correlation, but actual causality. And this is going to follow a 3-step process that is explained by Professor Lin at the National Chengchi University out of Taipei, Taiwan. His study first looks at whether or not there's correlation between the flatline rates of GDP per capita and poverty rates every single year. But next, he moves on to find out if there's correlation between the rate of changes every single year between these two statistical groups of poverty rates and GDP. And lastly, he sees that that correlation actually could mean causation through the use of the Granger causality test, which was created by Clive Granger in the early 1920s as a way to actually discover if there is a cause between one rate of change to another. There are limitations to this study and the way it's designed because at the end of the day, there is no surefire way to quantitatively prove causation. There are still qualitative aspects to the studies that this report does not look to solve. Now, after studying these implications through that method, we came up to a couple of results. That first test, which is a study between the correlation of the GDP per capita every year, which is shown on the x-axis, and the red bars, against the actual poverty rate within the country, which is measured by the blue line. Now, as this graph shows, and as a rate of 0.977 proves, there is strong correlation between these two rates, meaning as GDP per capita increases, the poverty rate goes down. And that is an incredibly strong value, meaning the relationship between these two rates is very clear. However, the next test in the method raises some questions. This graph is quite widely spread out, and the correlation isn't clear. That's why the R value of the test results comes out to a negative 0.3517. Now, that does mean there is some correlation, meaning that as the GDP rate of change increases, the poverty rate of change also increases to a somewhat relatable measure. However, it's a somewhat weaker result. And lastly, in the Granger results, we saw a 0.245 percentage possibility, meaning that there is a 24.5% chance that the correlation between the rates of change is only due to chance. Now, this is a lot of numbers, so let's put it into context. There's two potential outcomes of the Granger test. The first one is that this is just a chance. But the one that I believe is most likely to be true is that there is not a straightforward causality relationship between these two aspects. Simply speaking, there are many more factors that go into the creation of a poverty rate and what its current value is that is not just GDP growth. That is clear because although GDP rates correspond to a decreased poverty rate when they grow, the rates of change in the Granger causality test still predict that there is some sort of relationship. However, it's much weaker, meaning it's just one factor when there are many others that are potentially involved in the situation. Now, this result still has positive implications. It means that countries that are able to invest in their economy and increase the size of their economy still risk potentially bringing people out of poverty, which is a good thing. And it also means that moving forward, there is always a marginal benefit to increasing the size of the economy for everybody. However, there are also some negative implications. First and foremost, it means that the international community can't always just economically boost up a country and say it's going to solve all of their problems. The international community often likes to tout economic aid as its one solution fixes all problems. However, if this study is true, it would put forth the idea that simply throwing money at a problem can't make it go away. For incidents like the killings in the Philippines and the Rohingya in Southeast Asia, we simply can't just economically develop the countries and hope that the problem will go away. Because, as the Granger test and the second correlation study prove, economic increase isn't the only factor that goes into decreasing poverty rates and helping these marginalized groups. Now, lastly, there is an important limitation to what this study actually found. The World Bank, which is where I received all of the money data that I had, has serious gaps in its research. The money data that I used was a regional study, meaning it was compiling the data of over 18 countries in Eastern Asia. I had initially wanted to study the impacts in each country individually. However, the World Bank refuses or was unable to receive any economic data from these countries before 2007 on an individual country-to-country basis. Furthermore, the data before 2007 only brings up poverty rates every 3 years. The results may be skewed by the lack of data. Furthermore, it raises the question about how much data we have on a region of the world that has the fastest growing economies, which may raise questions about how much the World Bank has been willing to put in its efforts to actually care about these areas of the world that aren't the Eurocentric regions of Europe and the Americas. Meaning that at the end of the day, these conclusions are important, however, they might be marred by the fact that the World Bank's data isn't very complete. Today, we look to examine the question of whether or not GDP rates have a causal relationship with a decrease of poverty rates. And although the data was somewhat limited in its ability to be acquired, there was a clear lack of correlation, and the Granger test showed us that there is not a true link of causality between GDP growth increases and the decrease in the poverty rate, and that there may be many more qualitative factors that go into how we can combat poverty as a whole on the international scale. I thank you, and I'm ready to answer your questions.
What was one obstacle or challenge you encountered while implementing your research method, and how did you go about addressing that?
The Granger causality test is a lot more complicated than I originally thought it was going to be. The original source, the professor from the Taiwan Institute, made it sound very simple, and the way he lined it out in his paper had it very simplistically laid out. But upon trying to implement it myself, I found it much more complicated and at a higher level of statistics than I actually knew. So I ended up having to spend a couple hours watching informational videos and looking at a multitude of other reports to find out how to actually implement the causality test into my paper, especially because, as I didn't know at the beginning, each paper is going to have a slightly modified Granger causality test depending on what variables you're using. So the test isn't the same for every single paper because it depends on what specific economic indicators you're using.
Thank you.
Sure. So this is kind of like I'm going to stem off of one of the questions on here, but given all of its flaws, given how many are left behind, how do you think we should contextualize GDP as an economic indicator? And like, do you think there's a better indicator we really should use to evaluate economic growth in a country?
So although GDP and GDP per capita specifically is a good way to kind of see how the country as a whole is doing, I think some of the better indicators are measurements of where a percentage of the wealth is. So measurements of what sort of what amount of the population has the top 20% of the wealth and what percentage of the population has the lower 20% of the wealth. It's something that I stumbled upon in the World Bank while doing my research, and I think it could provide very unique analysis of where the wealth is being distributed across the country as a whole, specifically in countries that have violence being persecuted by those lower percentages, and how much of the population has that lower bit of the wealth.
As you are going to step out into the college and academia fields, think about the initial curiosity that led you to this specific inquiry. What other areas of inquiry might that same curiosity lead to as you move forward?
While this inquiry was a very quantitative study, I think there's a lot of qualitative impacts and causes to something like poverty rates, like I mentioned once or twice. And I think that's not only a harder study, because there isn't something like raw numbers to follow, but something that's also incredibly interesting, because those are the things where you need to go out and find personal experiences related very specifically to the region, as qualitative studies are very specific to the individual situations and, unlike numbers, aren't universally applied. And I think that's something moving forward that this research paper really begs for, which is a qualitative study of specific policies, how they were enacted, and how they were enforced, to actually see how economic laws in a region like Eastern Asia, which has seen massive economic growth, actually apply to these people who are being left behind.
Thanks, Blaise.
Cool.
Thank you everyone for staying.
Yeah.
Mark.